Welcome to World Regions Geography, Sub-Saharan Africa, Part 1. The learning outcomes. We hope to compare the physical geographies of the diverse regions of Sub-Saharan Africa, contrasting the climate and vegetation of the Sahel and the Congo Basin, and the East African Rift Valley and the Okavango, and the major rivers. We'll evaluate the role of physical geography, disease, and mineral resources in shaping conflicts, crises, landscapes, and economies. We'll identify the impacts of human activity on African wildlife and climates and some of the solutions to these threats. And we'll summarize the legacies of European colonialism and the Cold War in the region and how these, together with the diversity of ethnicities and religions and languages, have created conflict within and between countries. We'll explain how debt relief and the end of several conflicts and improving the status of women may increase the chance of positive economic and political futures in Sub-Saharan Africa. We'll describe the main causes of low agricultural production in Sub-Saharan Africa, connections of agriculture to desertification and deforestation, and the problems that emerge around land grabs. We'll analyze factors affecting the characteristics of populations in Sub-Saharan Africa, including the democratic transition, HIV/AIDS, and other diseases, and urbanization, fertility changes, and migration. We'll provide examples of how African people, goods, and culture have spread around the world as a result of slavery, colonialism, and urbanization. So we'll start off with Sub-Saharan Africa, some of the fastest growing economies in the world. Now the reason for this is quite simply, they started very low. So if you have $1 and you double it to $2, that's a 100% increase. You can have $100 and gain $5, which is greater in terms of total dollars, but it's only a 5% increase. So the economy started low so that the increases appear to be much more rapid, but they're still low. Peace is achieved in many regions. I mean, a decade or two ago, this region, all through here, through this region, a lot of conflicts going on, a lot of small wars, internal problems. A lot of those have started to settle down. There are still a lot of regions in Africa that have problems, particularly up in this region up here, in Somalia and Ethiopia, South Sudan region, this area through here, and you're starting to see some rise of organizations, ISIS-based organizations, Al-Qaeda-based organizations that are still spreading conflict through the region, but it's a little different than the ethnic genocide that was going on. Health indicators are starting to improve. This particular region in here and all through here were dominated by AIDS. That has started to slow. There's still a lot of problems, but we're beginning to make progress. So Africa is not a simple environment. It's large continent. It's a complex continent. You have extreme desert in this region up here. This is the Sahel through here, and it's this transitional zone between the desert and the savanna. And the region we're looking at is this region through the Sahel and all of this through here. So it's this whole Sub-Saharan Africa, everything below Sahara, the Sahara Desert. Climate and climate change. Now, Africa is kind of interesting because it's dominated by this Sub-Saharan Africa. This region below that orange, the red part right up here, this is the Sahara Desert, but this region below here is Sub-Saharan Africa, and it's dominated in this region, which is along the equator. And when you have the equator, you have wind currents that come from the north and wind currents that come from the south, and they come in and they form what's called an intertropical convergence zone, an ITCZ. And what happens there is the air comes from the north and from the south, and when they meet, it goes up. So you have this lift, and it comes up and around, comes up and around, and begins to dump. And that's why this dark blue in here. So it's really high rainfall area, and it pretty much rains every day. Now you have a subtropical high that makes for very stable atmosphere here, and so very stable tropical atmosphere. It's always going to be warm. Now the other thing that happens is during the winter months, out of this region in here, you have a wind. Instead of this wind blowing this direction, it comes this direction. So it's a very dry wind. So it has a very dry seasons, and that's the difference in that seasonal rainfall. The Sahel, which is that region along the north separating the Sahara from the sub-Saharan area, it is very susceptible to desertification, and that's that process of grasslands turning to desert. Part of that is because the lifestyle is pastoralism, which means that it's people herding cattle, primarily cattle, in this region, and they grow their larger herds, and so there tends to be some overgrazing. There's also some deforestation going on. They're clearing the land to increase the amount of pasture land. They're clearing the trees to increase pasture land, and they have very primitive, for lack of a better term, types of irrigation. Instead of having irrigation ditches and things like that, it's a lot of hand-carried water, so you're watering very small parts, and the area around it isn't getting water, and that exasperates the other problem with all of Africa, which is poor soils. Climate change. Africa is extremely vulnerable, and at the same time, Africa doesn't really have a lot of industry, so it has very low greenhouse gas emissions. It's vulnerable because all of this region through here is susceptible to desertification. If the rain pattern changes, which is one of the consequences of global warming, is a lot of times weather patterns change, rain patterns change. This area through here is very susceptible to drying out, and that exasperates the really poor soil. Soils in this region of Africa in particular are typical of tropical soils in that the soils are not very high quality. They're very dependent on lots of detritus, which is leaf material drops down and decays, and that's what provides nourishment and provides the ability of the soil to grow anything. But once you remove those trees and you don't have that detritus falling down, then these soils become depleted and are very susceptible to desertification at that point. they become depleted very quickly. Plate tectonics. Now, many of you have heard of Pangaea. That's originally where all of the continents were all collected in one large landmass right there. That was in the Permian period, about 250 million years ago. And then Gondwanaland, that is where it basically you split into two groups, which was this up here, which became Greenland, Europe, and Eurasia. And down here became South America, Africa, Australia, and Antarctica. And you see that continuing split until what we get into today. It's a plateau continent, which means it tends to be fairly high. There's a ridge, as you can see right along here. The lowlands typically are along the coast, and then it goes on this west side from about 1,000 feet up across over to here to about 1,500, 1,000 meters in height to about 1,500 meters in height. So it gains about 2,000 feet in elevation across the continent. The Rift Valley is this right here. Now, this was originally a rift valley which separated the Arabian from Africa and formed the Red Sea. Scientists are watching this through here because it's beginning, the rift is that separation of this section over here and this little part here coming off. This will eventually form either a peninsula swinging down like this, but this will be like a Red Sea, so it'll be separated from the rest of Africa, which will change the climate, allow seawater to flood into here, and change dynamics. This right now, the Rift Valley, is where you see a lot of the big herds that you always see in Africa. Water resources and dams. This is a great picture of Victoria Falls, largest waterfalls. Water resources, large river systems. You have the Congo, the Niger, the Nile. Big river systems. You have the Sud, which is Sudan, and it's a inland delta, which means that the rivers flow in, the water kind of disperses like the Sacramento River Delta, except that it comes back together on the other side and forms the Nile River, and then flows out the Nile into the Mediterranean, flows north. So the Sud is what Sudan is named after. Dam projects, the Kariba and the Okosombo, big major dam projects. Africa has a lot of potential for hydroelectric power. Damming up the rivers changes a lot of the habitat that happen along the rivers. It changes who controls the water, and may eventually lead to conflicts in and of itself.